Poisonous plants like the angel's trumpet, the larkspur, or even the bluebells are by no means the only poisonous plants in existence. We do, of course, have the phenomenon of toxic trees as well. And in this episode of Fabulous Folklore, we're going to have a look at the folklore of juniper, laburnum, and oleander. Hello there, and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult, and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author, and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are finishing off our April episode with the folklore of juniper, laburnum, and oleander. And I did think it was quite important, in a way, possibly, to put some toxic trees in here as well, because obviously we have been looking at flowers. And obviously we have looked at toxic trees before, back when we had a look at the yew tree episode. So, we're not exactly strangers to that kind of thing in these parts. It's also important to look at them as well because of the fact that they are quite common as well. I've actually seen one of these, the oleander, in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris, and laburnum is quite a common sight in gardens across Britain. Juniper is perhaps a slightly contentious inclusion, but I will explain why when we get to it. So please remember, as always, that this episode is for entertainment purposes only. It is not designed nor intended to replace medical advice. Do not consume or use any of these plants if you don't know what you're doing. So with that being said, let's go and meet the juniper. Now, juniper may seem like an odd entry into a post about toxic trees, but there are actually many species of juniper. I've seen the figure given as being anywhere between 40 and 60, and some of them are actually poisonous. So some juniper trees will indeed not do you much good. Now, that said, Juniperus communis, or common juniper, does actually provide the flavouring for gin, which comes from its berries. The berries are usable by people, however, large doses of the berries can be toxic, leading to convulsions, diarrhoea and vomiting. And the berries, and indeed the oil that comes from them, is not advised for consumption or use by pregnant women. And in fact, people did once use its oil to induce abortions. Now, to be fair, anything can be toxic in large enough doses, but it was worth including juniper because it does have toxic varieties. Now, elsewhere, juniper symbolically meant aid, asylum, love and succour, and magical practitioners might use it for anti-theft purposes, breaking curses or bindings. They also associated the tree with longevity. Now, historically, priests used juniper in the Egyptian embalming process, while the oil now appears in medicine, aromatherapy and perfumery. Interestingly, people would also petition the spirit of the juniper to find stolen items, and if you are interested in other magical uses for juniper, then I highly recommend the Treadwell's Book of Plant Magic because it's got an entry in there. Now, juniper does also have these protective associations. Mary apparently hid Jesus under a juniper during the flight into Egypt. God blessed the tree as a reward, giving it the power to deter evil. Now, people did also burn juniper leaves to drive away demons and then would keep them smouldering as a defence against plague. It also made a good doorstep tree, and according to Margaret Baker, any witches who wanted to enter a house had to count all the tiny leaves on the tree before they could do so. They would inevitably lose count and have to start again, which would then keep them outside your home. So, to be fair, they make a fairly good thing to keep by the door. And as a result, you shouldn't cut down a juniper tree, and in Wales it was believed anyone who did so would die within the year. As well as being able to keep witches outside, hanging juniper at the door was believed to protect the home from evil, and in Italy people brushed juniper branches across any holes in their houses to stop evil spirits from getting in. Philip and Stephanie Carr-Gomm recommend that to properly cleanse a room, you should hang a pouch containing juniper twigs or dried berries in it, and that will do the trick. They also assert that people use juniper smoke to cleanse themselves and their houses during the approach of summer, and it was also apparently used in Beltane fires to purify livestock, and the Scots burned juniper to ward off the evil eye. So you can see that despite the fact that obviously some varieties are toxic elsewhere, the tree does have quite a lot of good uses. Now, Christina Oakley Harrington notes the use of juniper in folk magic from ancient Greece all the way until the 20th century, and its protective qualities noted above also linked it with death. and therefore in ancient Greece, people would burn juniper berries at funerals in honour of the Furies, and they would burn the branches as incense for Hades. Roman emperors and generals, meanwhile, planted juniper trees in Livia's orchard, and if the trees withered, it meant there would be an early death or assassination for the specific emperor or general. It was also recommended to burn juniper in a room where a person had died, and the dried berries work best for this particular purpose. We're going to go from the juniper, which, as I say, just has some poisonous varieties, to the laburnum, which is incredibly toxic. And the laburnum tree is also known as the golden chain tree due to the formation of its yellow flowers. J.R.R. Tolkien apparently took his inspiration for the laurelin, one of the mythological trees in the Silmarillion, from the laburnum. And they are quite common in gardens around Britain, and I've often heard it said by people that if they hang over a pond, they can poison the fish in the pond because of how toxic every part of the tree is. But I don't know if this is one of those urban myths that people repeat, or if it's actually a genuine problem that people have. Now, according to the Alnwick Garden Poison Garden Souvenir Guide, all parts of this common garden tree are indeed harmful, and symptoms of poisoning include vomiting, coma, intense sleepiness, convulsive movements, unequally dilated pupils, and a slight frothing at the mouth. Now, that said, according to other articles I read, poisonings are thankfully rare, but Ruth Binney does relate a tale from 1843 in Inverness, where a youth working in service put dry laburnum bark into the broth for dinner because he'd apparently wanted to make a female servant vomit. We don't know why, but we can probably guess. Now, the cook actually became ill after noticing a strong taste in the broth, and it took her over a year to recover from the incident. So it's quite interesting that the youth used laburnum bark, because it's normally the seeds that actually pose a problem, because they come in these bean-like pods that will fall into the garden, and they're usually found by children who, when they find them, may indeed eat them. Which is why, obviously, if you do have a laburnum in your garden, just pay attention to things like that. Now, laburnum's symbolic meanings are blackness, forsaken, and pensive beauty. I'm not 100% sure what it means by blackness, but that's just what it said in the Flower Dictionary. And laburnum gets its association with pensive beauty because of the fact that the flowers are really pretty, but the tree itself is obviously incredibly poisonous. Now, the laburnum could be mistaken for gorse, since they both feature bright yellow flowers, which are a similar shape. However, gorse has needle-like sharp leaves, and the flowers appear all over the bush, whereas with laburnum flowers, they hang down in graceful clusters from their branches. So while the flowers look really similar, the actual tree or bush on which they grow are very, very different. Now, there is a final and rather interesting snippet of law that does come with these toxic trees, that if you cut down a laburnum tree, a neighbouring laburnum will then refuse to bloom the following season in protest, which seems like a strange move from the trees, but there we go. Now, we are going to move on finally to oleander, and Pliny the Elder actually described the oleander as being poisonous to beasts of burden, but an antidote for snake venom. And as with most things that Pliny said, he was utterly wrong, because oleander is incredibly toxic. Now, according to the Alnwick Garden Poison Garden Souvenir Guide, the foliage and flowers are toxic. The foliage can cause skin irritation, and even burning the wood creates irritating smoke. And in fact, the plant is so toxic, people refuse to sleep in the same room as oleander. And in Italy, people believe that bringing any part of the plant into the home would also bring disgrace, sickness, and misfortune, which probably explains why the oleander symbolically means beauty, beware, caution, distrust, danger, and grace, which is a bit of an odd collection of terms. But there we go. I think we've already discovered by now how contradictory the language of flowers can be. Now, the poison in the plant, oleandrin, brings on nausea, vomiting, weakness, an irregular heartbeat, and a decreased heart rate. And it is toxic to animals as well, though the leaves apparently taste rather bitter. And poisonings of people are quite rare, since the leaves taste awful, although livestock have died after the leaves were accidentally mixed into their hay. 2 toddlers actually died in Southern California in 2000 after chewing the leaves, and in the novel and film Dragonwyck, the villain poisons his wife by crumbling oleander leaves into her food. So it does have a few associations, but again, actually finding a lot of poisonings involving it are actually a lot more rare. Now, the oleander apparently gets its name from a tale in Greek mythology, that of Hero and Leander. And Hero was a princess of Aphrodite, while Leander was her lover. And he would swim across the Hellespont every night so he could see her. And to guide his way, Hero left a lamp burning for him in her tower. Unfortunately, one wintry night, the wind blew out the lamp, With no light to guide him, Leander lost his way in the strait and then drowned. And in one version of the legend, Hero then walked up and down the shore the next day looking for him, crying, "O Leander, O Leander." And when she found his broken body, he still clutched an oleander flower. And she later threw herself from her tower to join him in death. So that is apparently where it got the name oleander from. Now, oleander does also appear elsewhere in Greek myth, because Haralampos v. Harissus suggests that the Pythia, or the Oracle of Delphi, actually used to use oleander to issue prophecies on behalf of the god Apollo, and he argues that chewing the leaves and inhaling the smoke would provide the somewhat ecstatic symptoms described in ancient literature while the oracle was issuing her prophecies. Now, there is also a bit of an urban legend associated with oleander, and it does seem to appear in tales of both murders and accidental deaths, but as with everything, you do need to look a little bit more closely into it, because Amy Stewart relates the urban legend of campers dying after using oleander twigs as skewers, and the Anna Garden Poison Garden Souvenir Guide elaborates further, because according to them, French soldiers used oleander branches to make skewers during the Peninsular War, and they used the skewers to cook their meat over a fire. 7 of the 12 who ate the meat apparently died. And this is something that you will find repeated again and again and again in loads of different places. But the problem is this story bears all the hallmarks of an urban legend. Why? Because it's actually quite difficult to find genuine reports of this happening. The stories always repeat the same central aspect, and that's people using oleander twigs to make skewers. They then roast the food over a fire using these skewers and then either die or fall very ill as a result. Now, this particular story has been ascribed to everyone from Alexander the Great soldiers to those of Napoleon, but the lack of any solid evidence really does mean that it's more likely to be an urban legend, making it quite disappointing to see it repeated as a hard fact in certain books. And I think because I was able to find stuff about how this is actually probably not that common and has been attributed to so many people, it did make me think, well, if I've been able to find that particular information, why have these other authors not been able to? But there we go, that's the importance of researching any of these things. As I say, the oleander you will find used in ornamental ways because it is so pretty, and as with everything, it's one of those things where kind of leave it alone and just enjoy its beauty from afar. And that's much the same with laburnums as well, to be fair. And as a result, these trees are all beautiful, and they're probably quite safe to have in your garden as long as you're aware of the risks associated with them. And if you do enjoy trees and shrubs for an ornamental purpose, then fair enough, crack on. As I say, the laburnum is the only one that I'd keep an eye on, basically if you do have small children around, as I say, when they are then dropping their seed pods and so on. Now, obviously, in the case of juniper, the common variety is actually quite safe, but as long as you take precautions when using the oil. If you're not sure which variety of juniper you've actually got, have a professional identify it before you start using it for anything. And obviously, in the case of oleander and laburnum, just like show them respect and enjoy them from a distance, and you should be fine. That is the final episode in our Poisonous Plants month for April, so I hope you enjoyed it. Next month we are going to have a look at some Roman gods, but we are going to have a look at them in the context of Roman gods as they appear in Britain. And this is partially because obviously I'm in Britain, and it's always quite interesting to see how these figures sort of dovetail with local legends, but then also how they were actually worshipped in obviously a very different setting than what they were intended to be worshipped in. So we are going to be having a look at those. We are going to start off with Neptune and Oceanus, because they're essentially like the patron gods, as it were, of Newcastle upon Tyne, where I live, obviously. And as it was quite an important site in Roman times, I thought it would be quite a good place to start with something that I actually had a bit more personal experience with, shall we say. So that's what we're doing. If you are a Patreon supporter, then you will be getting the exclusive episode very soon, which is about Celtic gods and goddesses. And that's quite interesting because that also includes a few local to me as well. And also, if you missed the Cemetery Law illustrated talk that I did, then you can get access to the replay of that if you are a subscriber at the £5 a month tier or more on Patreon. So there we go. So anyway, I hope that you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you next week when we toddle off to go and meet some of the Roman gods of Britain. So if you've got any requests as well, I've actually put my little request form below. You can just drop in what it is that you'd like to hear about. You don't have to fire up email programs or hop over to Twitter or anything like that. You just hit the link and it'll take you to a Google form. You don't have to give your name if you don't want to, but if you do, I can obviously give you a shout out as it's your request. Otherwise, obviously just put in whatever it is that you'd like to learn about, and if I can, then I will obviously try and get to as many of them as I possibly can. But other than that, as I say, have a lovely week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.